Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Crossley, and today I'm going to be presenting on plagiarism detection using keystroke logs. This is work I've done with my colleagues Terry Etienne, June Sochoy, Langdon Holmes, and Wesley Morris. Most of us out of Vanderbilt University. Much of this was funded by the National Science Foundation, and we are all members of LEAR Lab, which is the Language and Educational Analytics Research Lab. So let's talk a little bit about generative AI. As we know, it has vastly changed the landscape, especially for writing assessment, and we're mostly interested in writing assessment in this talk. Why we're interested in writing assessment is because Gen AI can produce writing samples that are basically indistinguishable from human writing, especially for lower level writers that you would find kind of in 6th through 12th grades. And importantly, for teachers and administrators, students can now demonstrate performance in the absence of learning. So they can basically demonstrate that they're good writers without absolutely knowing what they're writing about because Gen AI produces it. Of course, it's also difficult now because Gen AI makes plagiarism detection challenging, if not impossible to do. There have traditionally been kind of two detection approaches that have been used with the written product. And that is using Gen AI to detect Gen AI, which is a little circular, and then looking at style metrics. So looking at the actual linguistic features or language features in the text and seeing if they differ between that produced by Gen AI and that produced by authentic writers. And another problem is that as Gen AI proliferates and matures, the detection accuracy that we have for detecting whether an essay is written by a human or an AI has decreased. So let's talk a little bit about our solution. And our solution here is basically the idea that we should focus on the writing process, not the writing product. And nicely, Gen AI has led to an increased interest in the writing process because the teachers and administrators can no longer really control the product. Teachers and administrators are starting to think more about the cognitive process of writing. And these kind of focus on teaching and assessing the writing process can negate generative AI production because you're really focusing on things like pre-writing, developing ideas, drafting an essay, revising and editing that essay, and maybe proofreading that, right? But at some point, we still are going to have to assess the final written product. And so that written product is basically the characteristics of what is written. And it can be linguistic features like lexical grammatical features. It can be structure, paragraph sentences. But mostly you're going to find human side of assessment, focusing on things like argumentation, style, cohesion, rhetorical functions, and appeal. And this product should represent the student's knowledge. This is what we really want to assess, right? But how do we assess student production while ensuring that it is not Gen AI? And we want to develop metrics to do this. So a solution that I'm going to talk about today is the idea that we can look at process basically within a walled garden uh, and see if there are differences between folks who write authentically and those folks who might transcribe information. Um, so as I mentioned before, I don't think that AI detection models that focus on the product alone are going to be successful at identifying or combating plagiarism, and we don't want students to be plagiarists because we want to be able to judge students on their knowledge. But we also at the same time do expect that students are going to be digitally illiterate. So we want them to appropriately use Gen AI to amplify their knowledge. So we don't want to cut them off from generative AI. And so some folks have started talking about a walled garden approach. And this is basically the use of controlled digital writing environments that monitor student writing, but also allow students to access information and produce ideas. So almost like Google Classroom, if you ever used that before. It provides a tighter control of the writing process, and it helps to ensure that the information produced by the students kind of reflects that student's writing ability. But even within walled gardens, plagiarism is still possible because students could go outside the walled garden. They could talk to ChatGPT, they could ask it to write an essay, and then they could transcribe that essay directly into the walled garden. They could produce an essay within the walled garden that looked like it was written by themselves, but it came from outside that walled garden. And because, the walled garden doesn't have access to what happens outside the walled garden, it is not going to know that this essay was produced by generative AI. So there are some ways to cut through the walls of this walled garden. So what about transcription then? And I guess one of our bigger questions here is that process of transcribing different from authentic writing? So if a student goes outside of a walled garden, asks generative AI to produce an essay, and then transcribes that, uh, is that process of transcribing different than a student who actually writes an essay in a naturalistic environment without the help of generative AI? And of course, we know it's going to be different because transcriptions don't involve things like drafting or revising or editing or proofreading. But how can we measure this? And one answer is keystroke logging. And so keystroke logging is an observational tool that is commonly found in writing research. It's basically just recording keystrokes, mouse clicks, and movements during text production. And you can see when students are inserting or deleting, cutting, pasting, replacing, moving the cursor or mouse movements, everything is time stamped. It's nice because it's unobtrusive, it's ecological, and it is very, very scalable. All right, so that brings us to the key questions that I've already hinted at. But the main key question is, can keystrokes be used to predict transcription processes and argumentative writing? There has been some work on this in other studies. They've been most of them quite small scale. They haven't looked at writing that you would find in the classroom. So folks have looked at fables and emails and also maybe descriptive writing. Our hypothesis that guide this quick little study is that the cognitive demands found in authentic essay writing will lead to like a unique keystroke profile as compared to transcription. And if we can develop this reliable profile, we can then use to detect when students are plagiarizing external text within a controlled writing setting. So this is a relatively niche little market that we're dealing with here. All right, so this is what we did. We took 500 high-quality, authentic argument essays collected along with their keystroke logs. We did high-quality, authentic essays because Gen AI very rarely produces anything but high-quality writing. We then had those same 500 essays transcribed along with the keystroke logs also. Our participants in both were mechanical Turk workers. They were all over the 18. They lived in the United States. We removed transcriptions that had flawed logs or that didn't have enough semantic overlap with the original essays, and we removed some unreliable workers. In the top right here is actually the work space that the Turkers had, and this is kind of like some of the keystroke logging information we have in the bottom right. Okay, so we then, from all this data, aggregated these keystroke logs into meaningful measures. So we looked at basically five things. We looked at production fluency, and this is just stats on different linguistic units. We looked at bursts, so basically continuous text production, pauses, how often folks paused, revisions when students deleted and inserted, and then process variance, so standard deviation of production rate. We then threw these into machine learning models, right? First, we wrangled up the data to remove multilinear variables. So we had about 65 variables in the end. We went through four different machine learning models, linear discriminant analysis, multilayer perceptron, random forest, support vector machine. The normal stuff, cross-validation, train test set with 70-30 split that was stratified. You can see over here on the right-hand side, the random forest performed very well. It had an F1 of 0.99. And you can see on the bottom of that figure table, that only 3 essays were misidentified. So seems to be some pretty strong evidence that there are differences between transcribed writing and authentic writing. What are those differences? So authentic writing is basically monitored writing, and it's definitely non-linear, right? So it has a greater number of pauses, a greater number of insertions and longer insertions. Writers deleted more words and characters, or a greater number of revisions, and greater deviation on the number of keystrokes they produced. Transcribed writing, on their hand, is very much based on working memory constraints, and it's a very linear process. So you would see things like greater number of pauses within words and after words, greater product process ratio, and longer lengths of writing bursts than authentic writers. And there's a lot of numbers on the right-hand side if you're interested in very important measures and means and standard deviations between authentic and transcribing writers. So what are our quick takeaways? Authentic and transcribed writing can be strongly predicted based on keystroke logs. models do not depend on the written product, but on the written process, right? So these models that we've shown here should be accurate regardless of the generative AI model that's used, and any changes that happen in Gen AI models, because we're not looking at the product, but at the process. We hope that we can use these models within a controlled writing space to detect potential plagiarism resulting from transcribing AI-generated texts. And we should allow, these models can also allow for like process-based evaluations and feedback for writers and for teachers to better understand what's happening with their students. All right, thank you so much for your time.